afternoon and welcome back to our final session in this afternoon's our day's conference on teacher education in digital media literacy. For those who have been with us all day, thanks for sticking with us. It's been a long day, a bit of a marathon, but it's great to have you still with us. And to those who are joining, you're very welcome for our final session this afternoon, which is on raising standards, opportunities and expectations in digital media and information literacy among teachers, which I have the pleasure to chair. So we're hoping to have a really interesting discussion for the next hour. As you can see on the screen, we have a great lineup of panelists this afternoon, starting with Renee Hobbs, followed by Matthew Johnson, then Juliane von Reppert-Bismarck, and then Onno Hansen-Staszyński. So our four panelists this afternoon have agreed with me that they will each take a few minutes to give us their take on teacher education in this world of digital media information. And then we will have an opportunity to open up the discussion. And of course, you are very welcome to put your questions, points of view into the chat as well. If you haven't already done so, you can still add your organizational name to your name on the list of participants. That's always helpful. And let me start, because I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming our very old friend and wonderful academic and practitioner in this field, who I think is no stranger to everybody here, and that's Renee Hobbs. Renee is Professor of Communication Studies, Director of the Media Education Lab at the Harrington School of Communication and Media, the University of Rhode Island, who's one of the founders of the National Association for Media Literacy Education in the States, and a founding co-editor of the Journal of Media Literacy Education. We all know Renee from the many books and many articles that she has authored, and of course from the Trojan work that she and her team have been doing for quite some time. It's a bit early, Renee, is it?
I am so delighted to be here, Sally. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I did love listening in on a previous conversation, although it was a bit early, and I'm grateful to have coffee here.
Very necessary. Let's get us started, Renee. Give us your talk.
Get us started. Here we go. Here are the four things that I'm hoping to talk a little bit about today. Let me see if I want to see if you can see my slide. Can you see give me a thumbs up if you can see
your slide.
Beautiful.
No
problem. So the four topics that I'm hoping to put on the table for the conversation. I love the title of this initiative around raising standards and opportunities and expectations. It's so future oriented. But actually, the comments that I'm going to offer are actually rooted in my own history. And so for those of you who don't know, next year marks my 30th year as a media literacy teacher educator. My first encounter with teaching media literacy happened in 1993 at the Harvard Institute on Media Education, sponsored at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I brought together 200 elementary and secondary teachers over 2 years to wrap our heads around media literacy. And with help from people like Neil Postman, Joshua Meyerowitz, Pat Ofterheide, Barry Duncan, John Pungenti, and other experts, we were trying to figure out a model for how to scale up. And so I think it's really useful to think a little bit about the problem of scale continuing, even after 30 years, to be the challenge that we all are experiencing. As we have lots of experts now and lots of resources and lots of opportunities, but at the ground level, the problem of scale is really real. Some of that is because, in the United States at least, some of that is because of the mobility of teachers, right? Teachers and principals and superintendents may move around. We know that in the United States, about 40% of teachers leave the profession after 5 to 7 years, right? So the problem of scale is that we need an always accelerating number of people to participate, knowing that they're not always going to stay in the same school community. They're not always going to be teaching the same thing. And that scale is just a continual challenge for us. I want to talk a little bit about the why part of it, because over 30 years, I think one thing I've discovered is that the power of the inciting incident. Let me describe to you my very first work in a school district in Massachusetts, in Billerica, Massachusetts, where the superintendent of schools had been one of the original school leaders to sign up for a very controversial platform at that time called Channel One. It was a combination of 10 minutes of news targeted to teenagers with 2 minutes of advertising. And the controversy over advertising in schools was just, whew, an inciting incident. But it created an opportunity to bring media literacy into that school district with the idea that kids needed to analyze both news and advertising as part of civic education. So since then, we've seen a lot of inciting incidents, right? And of course, most recently, the fake news crisis, the disinformation crisis. We've seen the violence crisis, the substance abuse crisis, the body image and gender crisis, you name it. Inciting incidents have brought people to the table, right? Caused people to see a need for media literacy that they didn't see before. As much as you have all heard me talk about media literacy as an expanded conceptualization of literacy, that does not create an inciting incident, except maybe to address people's fear about the loss of traditional print literacies, which we can't really speak to so powerfully. So I do think it's really worth reflecting. Davina in the last talk talked about the inciting incident being our fear of algorithms and recommendation engines and the manipulation that's embedded in them. So it's worth reflecting on what's brought you to the table. What was your inciting incident? What are the likely current and future inciting incidents that will bring people to the table to really address the most important question for teachers is, why should I do this? Why should I invest? So I do want to talk a little bit about investing in learning, inclusive learning communities, because one thing I've discovered over 30 years is that it takes about 3 years for a teacher who begins a journey of exploration in media literacy to feel confident and comfortable in implementing it in the classroom. And I think we ask too much of teachers when we give them a half-day training and we give them a curriculum and lesson plan and we say, now go do it. Like, that's really a problem in our field right now. And I think bureaucrats might claim success, check the boxes, say we did teacher training, but I don't believe it for a minute, because my experience in the ground is that teachers need a lot of handholding. They need to be part of a learning community. And they need to have conversations about the challenges of this work with their peers for a long period of time before they solve the challenges of student voice, for instance, right? Right? Of unleashing creativity, of critical conversations about institutional power. And so finally, let me talk about the last issue, the issue of mobilizing evidence on the state of media literacy implementation at the hyper-local level. It has been great that the EU's initiatives have helped us get a better understanding of what media literacy looks like cross-nationally, across the member states. And isn't that thrilling to see that happen? But I think if we're going to press forward in raising standards, opportunities, and expectations for teacher education, we need to mobilize evidence at the very, very ground level. I want to tell you the story of a student who reached out to me, a high school senior from Maynard, Massachusetts, when she learned that we had done a new measure that looks at the 16 instructional practices of media literacy and asks parents and teachers and school board members, librarians to tell us how likely is it that a student in your school will encounter one of these 16 learning practices. This high school student reached out to me and she said, I would like to give this survey to the kids in my high school. And lo and behold, she adapted the survey, right? And collected data in her high school. And now that high school, and shared it with her high school principal, right? It was her senior project. And now that high school teacher is like, okay, yeah, this is a problem. We're not teaching these important things. And now a teacher group has been formed. The librarian is offering professional development. They're reaching out to other experts. So it turns out that when we have evidence about the current state at the local level of media literacy, it creates an, I don't want to say this, it creates a shame opportunity. What a shame that only 20% of your kids are learning about the business of media, when it turns out the business of media is selling their attention. And like, if you graduate from high school and you don't know that, you're at a disadvantage. So I do think there's a lot of opportunities for us to gather data at the hyperlocal level and leverage that to address the problems of scale.
Renee, thank you so much. We could just go into every single one of those points and spend the rest of our hour talking about them. However, we're going to park that for the moment. So we're talking about scale. We're talking about continuity of training, not just the once-offs. That idea of the spark something, as you say, we have lots of things that are sparking at the moment in terms of making our work more important, and the shame principle, the gathering of evidence. All super stuff to guide our discussion, but I'd like to bring in our next panelist, and that's Matthew Johnson. He's Director of Education for MediaSmarts, which is Canada's Centre for Digital Media Literacy. So it's equally early in the morning for Matthew. He is the author of many of MediaSmarts' lessons, parent materials, and interactive resources. And he's the architect of MediaSmarts' Use, Understand, Engage digital literacy framework for Canadian K-12 schools. He has presented MediaSmarts materials on topics such as copyright, cyberbullying, body image, and online hate to parliamentary committees, academic conferences, and governments and organisations around the world. And we're delighted to have you with us. Matthew, your take on our topic.
Thank you, Sally. And, you know, I can this is a really interesting discussion, though I think we may wind up mostly just nodding at what the other people on the panel are saying. I'm not sure how much we're going to be disagreeing, but that's not always a problem. As you know, or may know, media literacy is in the school curricula of each province and territory in Canada, and in fact has been for almost 20 years now. But we also know from our own research that teachers often feel unprepared to integrate it into their classroom practice, and it is often done in a superficial way or left for last. When I address recent graduates, I often ask them, how many times have you had a course that was supposed to have media literacy in it where the only actual media literacy activity was watching the movie of the book or the play that you just read? And at least a third of the hands always go up. So as a result, a big part of our mission at MediaSmarts is giving teachers the support they need. And a big part of that has been our ongoing work of establishing clear standards for what digital media literacy is and for how we know whether students and teachers are media literate. So I'm going to share now just very briefly the work that we have done that was actually published just last spring, both on integrating digital and media literacy and into a single discipline and identifying the core competencies and in general the standards again for teachers and for students. Oops, I went all the way through that. Hang on. Let's try that again. All right.
Where's well, we're seeing your inbox, which is very interesting.
My inbox. Yes,
no, but we're back now. We're fine. We're back with your slide now.
All right, excellent. So to begin with, this is our definition of our integrated definition of digital media literacy. I won't spend too much time on it, but we define it fundamentally as the ability to critically, effectively, and responsibly access, use, understand, and engage with media of all kinds. Now that's a lot of verbs and adverbs. I think it is important to include all of those. Of course, we've seen, I think one of the things that we've seen in the last decade is that it is easily possible to have practical knowledge of media making without necessarily knowing how to use it responsibly. In exactly the same way that you can know how to drive a car, but not know how to follow the rules of the road. So we divide this into three different categories, you might say, three different assessment groups. The first is competencies, and competencies are what students need to be able to do, the skills that we expect them to demonstrate. Topics are the domain knowledge that students need to know, the different things that the different subjects, the different topics. And finally, key concepts are what students need to understand. And so our standards for assessment are based on that, what sometimes called the KUD, the know, understand, and do categories. What students need to do, those core competencies, are broken down into 4 things. First is access. Now, access is also a precondition, and that's why you'll see in this graphic it underlays all the other ones, because of course we cannot do any of those other things without the ability to access. But there are also access skills, and some of those are simply being able to access things effectively, like using search engines, but there are of course also specialized access skills, such as using accessibility technology, or even for some marginalized youth, being able to access free or discounted sources of internet. Our framework topics are the 9 different subjects that we cover. And again, this is designed to integrate the 2 disciplines of digital and media literacy, because the distinction between them makes any sense anymore. And so you can see within this framework things that are very strongly from the media literacy tradition, such as what we call reading media, which is understanding how media communicate meaning, media representation, how our understanding of reality and ourselves is shaped by media. You also see some categories that are drawn more specifically from the digital literacy tradition, like privacy and security, and ethics and empathy, things no relevance in the broadcast media. And then there are ones, of course, that overlap, things like media health, community engagement, and making and remixing, that really are to both disciplines. And so we have, in fact, a series of lessons in all 9 of these categories from kindergarten to grade 12 that do provide teachers with a starting point for digital media literacy education throughout the pre-secondary years. And finally, the key concepts, what we need to understand, the critical side of digital media literacy. Some of you may know this is the approach that has traditionally been taken here in Canada towards media literacy. These 5 key concepts that were developed in the 1980s, starting from the idea that media are constructions, making even very young children understand that what they are consuming or using was made by someone, and then other concepts that emerge from that follow from that. The commercial implications, the social and political implications, the influence of different aesthetic forms, and the fact that audiences negotiate meaning, that our relationship with media is not one way, that we bring our own experience and our own identity to it. Now, those were, as I said, developed in the 1980s when the media ecosystem looked like this. There were a small number of creators and, more importantly, distributors. We have a largely separate experience. You might talk to someone else about the TV show you watched the night before, but fundamentally, media flowed to us in one direction, and that was the end of it. However, this is what our media ecosystem looks like now. We are all at the center of an infinite network. Now, that doesn't mean that all the nodes in the network have equal influence or equal control. Some absolutely do have more. And those forces that were powerful, the media makers, the media distributors in the old model, still have a great deal of power. But it's so that insight that digital media are networked has given rise to another set of key competencies, or sorry, key concepts that apply specifically to network media. So those original 5 apply to all media. They apply just as much to TikTok as they do to Vogue magazine, whereas these ones are ones that we need to understand specifically digital media. Though, of course, as we go forward, and particularly for young people, all media experiences, even reading a magazine or even things that feel like traditional media experiences like watching Netflix, are media digitized today. And so the distinction that these apply only to network media is becoming less and less relevant. All right. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We have a little bit of gremlins in the system. I don't know whether it's because Canada early morning, a little bit of audio coming and going, but I think we caught all of that pretty well. But thank you so much. Third panelist, I'm delighted, needs no introduction also, of course, to this community, and that's Juliane von Reppert-Bismarck. Juliane is the founder and executive director of Lie Detectors, award-winning and journalist-led news literacy organization, raising awareness of disinformation and media bias among school children and their teachers. Juliane represented Lie Detectors within the European Commission's high-level expert group on digital disinformation and fake news, and has advised politicians and lawmakers on anti-radicalization and lateral literacy in an age of media pluralism. And we invited Juliane in particular because of the work she's doing with teachers and the insights she can share with us based on the recent research work that they've carried out. Juliane.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. So thanks so much, Sally, for this great invitation and for the really excellent speakers throughout the day. And just now I was nodding along to what Renee was saying about half a day not being enough to get teachers up to speed and the need to create learning communities. I'll tell you very briefly. So we also spoke earlier on about the wisdom of using journalists in media literacy work. And I'm happy to talk about that in the discussion, but Sally has asked me specifically to talk to you about what we have been hearing from the teachers that we work with, because we interact with them very directly and have been asking them a lot of questions. So I'll tell you a tiny bit about what Lie Detectors has been doing, and then go straight into what we're hearing from the teachers. So as Sally said, we work with journalists. We're working really at scale. We started in 2017, so we're nowhere near as established time-wise as Renee, but we are currently sending journalists into 1,400 individual classrooms every year across 5 countries, if you count the analog ones, and if you also count the ones where we walk in digitally via video conferencing, it's a lot more countries, and we work in 3 languages. And as we're working more and more in advisory capacities to kind of pass on the best practice that we're getting from that we're learning from our work. So I would like to tell you a little bit about what has changed also in the question of this kind of work that we do with journalists. So COVID appears to have been a real game changer and has really bumped this whole issue up the policy priority list. I think we all know that. I can tell you that the teachers have been more engaged. We measured their engagement, and the momentum since the pandemic has just been on the rise extraordinarily. We've got data on that, but the policymakers are also more engaged. So we actually have now, for those of you who don't know, there's the European Democracy Action Plan, which actually spells out that the European Commission will support journalist activities that send journalists back into classrooms to support media literacy teaching. That's extremely explicit. We've also got these teacher guidelines that just came out in October that Georgi was talking about earlier this morning, which specifically referred to the ability of teachers to resort to guest speakers, very much because of this half a day is not enough, right? And then very specifically from Andres Schleicher at the OECD, who says everybody needs the skills to be a journalist. Like, you can't be more clear than that. So we've got our marching orders and are really happy about the work that we're doing. But nonetheless, we really do see that teachers are an absolutely fundamental component of getting this right. I know what Hans Martins said was right this morning about curricular overload. But if we can get teachers involved and get them trained up and ready and fluent and confident, then those are the kind of multipliers that have got to exist within schools, and that will allow journalists like our community of 250 plus to go back to the work of journalism that they're doing and that they rightfully should be doing. So, you have to imagine that we've been asking, this year we did a very specific thing where we asked teachers, we asked, I think 670, almost 700 teachers. And you've got to imagine that they're quite different types of teachers. They're primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, they're teachers from the elite international schools, but also teachers who as recently as spring 2020, literally were in classrooms with zero digital access, no Wi-Fi, no broadband, no PowerPoint way of showing anything at all, where we had to do our work completely in analog, talking about digital issues in an entirely non-digital classroom. We work in classrooms with very high proportion of people whose first and even second languages is not the language of the country, and also in rural schools in geographically isolated regions. So the diversity of the teachers that we asked, very broad. Also teachers employed as civil servants, like in Germany, or the ones that we see in Belgium and Brussels very often, who basically hop on a bicycle as soon as their lesson is over and cycle to the next school because they're actually freelancers. So these are very different kind of working conditions. And yet the answers that they gave us to our questions are really remarkably similar. So first of all, they say they want journalists, they like the authenticity, they like the actual expert opinion, they like the openness, they like an honest exchange. They, however, also want to do it themselves. They tell us that this belongs into their classroom. I wish I could have printed this out, but you've really got to imagine that we've got like teachers from all the way from, regular literacy learning to politics and ethics to biology and maths and art and primary school. And most of them are saying, this material belongs into my classroom. And I think this is important for my students aged 10 to 15 to know about. However, when we ask them whether they've addressed it themselves, it's an entirely different story. So even if like 100, not 100, right, but we're really talking about like 97, 96% of teachers saying, yes, this is important for my classroom. When you say, have you talked about this? Have you talked about that? The answers are not at all the same. So we have 60% if you're lucky. And those are the very engaged teachers, the ones that have already asked us into the classroom. God knows what the proportion is like for other teachers. And it's not really surprising. This is one thing I have printed out. It's not really surprising because it's actually what we're talking about is a really quite an intimidating space, right? You can easily slip into conversations about conspiracy theories. And then what are you going to do about the parents, ringing up afterwards, And you're also talking about digital spaces where the kids have found their own niches. They're not in the same places where the adults are. And I've printed this out. It's horizontal, but I'm going to show it to you like this, just so that you see it. So if you think the orange lines are the kids, right? And the blue lines are the teachers, all right? This is based on 11,000 kids and 700 teachers, okay? And you can't read it because it's way too small. But I can tell you that this one here is TikTok. So the relative use of these places, and we ask them, where do you go online to inform yourself, right? These are the things that they tell us. So they're alone on TikTok. They're alone on Twitch and Discord. These things are gaming platforms. This is a place where teachers would never step. So to talk about it is extremely difficult. And they tell us they're not equipped, they don't have time, nobody's rewarding them for this. And the amazing thing is that they still do want to. They tell us this is part of their mission. We just recently had a workshop to talk about something like building a learning community. And we can talk about that perhaps in a discussion, but it's something that we're extremely interested in seeing whether we can help to bring that kind of community about. They tell us that there are incentives to which they would respond. And the incentives to which they said they would respond are, they want the timing for the training to actually not be during the weekend. They want to be given the time during working hours to learn about this stuff, not to give up their Saturday and Sunday. They want recognition. It doesn't have to be, they tell us it does not have to be an official certification from one of the very established places, but it's got to be some kind of recognition, for instance, that they can show the school management, so recognition and reward. It also needs to be the kind of training that they want needs to be provided by organizations that are actually independent. They're quite twitchy about this. Trust among teachers is something that is really hard to earn. Once you've earned it, you can get very far, but you have to work at it. And so 2/3 of the teachers that we work with tell us that our independence from commercial or political interest is important or very important for them when they decide to work with us. They also want to really spend a minimum amount of time on learning how to use materials. Materials should be ready to go. That's why I was saying that I love Davina's crossover, because you open the website and you know what to do. It's super simple. You know, if you have like massive instructions manuals that you've got to read through, you can forget it. They also, and this is the one that I think is actually incredibly interesting, that they say is they want to know when they've done enough. You know, what is it that, you know, how much do they need to do to be able to say, I have got my kids to the level they need to be at, you know? And there, I would really love to see whether we can talk a little bit about this idea of, can we create like a quality seal on materials? Or actually, even more interestingly, I think, like if we think of critical digital literacy as being a muscle that you don't just train once, but you have to keep training, and you have to keep keeping it up daily, again and again. It's not a finite thing, and you practice, you know, but something that you actually practice daily. Can we have something that is almost the equivalent of the 5 a day, you know, 5 fruits and vegetables keep you alive, as Peppa Pig will have told you, or Mr. Potato, or whatever his name is. You know what I mean? If we can make that, if the teachers have a place where they can pick their 5 a day, I think we're really getting somewhere. So, and that's all. There's loads more to talk about, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well done, Juliane. And despite the fact I stopped you from using PowerPoints and you were I don't blame you for trying to share, we just put a message into the chat to show we have an article from you in last month's newsletter, and the chart is in there and all the documentation is in there for people to share. Thank you so much. Lots of questions, lots of open points for us to come back to, but I'd like to come to our final panelist this afternoon, and that's Onno Hansen-Staszyński. Onno is an innovator in the fields of media education, tackling disinformation and digital identities. As chairman of the EZE Foundation, co-founder and teacher trainer, their Dynamic Identity Academy, co-initiator and partner of numerous European and Polish projects, and he's a part-time teacher. Onno and his wife pilot, implement and teach a blend of media education, prophylactics and media creation. Onno, give us your take on this.
Yeah, well, first, I'd like to tell you where I come from. For us, we're Binckhorst. There's a few friends who came from Rhode. Rhode is the organization that started Bad News. Some of you might know the disinformation game. Basically, what we try to do is reinvent ourselves all the time and the fields around us. So I'm going to keep it short and uncomfortable. That's sort of the hallmark that we're striving for. What I'm going to talk about is what I do with my wife in the classroom, or my wife and me rather, because she's more active than I am, to be honest. What is happening there is we're trying to find out what is the environment that we work in. And to start with, the digital media literacy is not a regular topic. It's a divisive topic, because for kids it's an in-group topic. It's something they do, it's private for them, what they do online. So already you have like a little resistance to talk about it. It's like, this is from me. Also, it's a generation divide, which has become much stronger after COVID regulations, because kids feel they've been mistreated during and afterwards. Even now, when they had their final exams, teachers were prioritizing having everything done on time rather than looking for the psychological and social impact of COVID regulations on them. So if you look at what's happening, you have a divisive subject that you have to teach. And to understand what it means, we started to look at what happens in a regular classroom, what processes are going on. And that's something that has rarely been researched. If somebody has great research, and I'd love to hear it, because basically what we found in our ADT project, or program, I should say, is that what happens is, if you start in a high school, in Poland, you got a system where you go in a new high school after your primary school, the moment you're like 15 years old. So you get into a new classroom, and what you see there is a lot of negative behavior at the beginning, disregard, even hostility. And these levels stay the same throughout the first year, don't change. And what does change is the level of adaptation to the teacher and to other kids. So what you see is there's more respect, there's more cooperation, and you might be able to think oh, wow, this is a classroom that's really functioning. But everything underneath never changed. So from time to time, stuff flares up, especially with divisive subjects. And it looks like, oh, I got a bad generation, a bad year, bad kids, hormones, brain, what have you, which is completely untrue. It just never has been addressed. But if you would address it, for instance, with a sort of mix up what we're doing with prophylactics, mental health on the one side, and media education, media creation, on the other side is one big lump. If you do that, what happens is the negative behavior becomes less. There is less exclusion in the classroom. There is less hostility. There is observed hostility, I should say. There is less disregard, but at the same time, the classroom is more difficult. Because what happens is they don't adapt that easily anymore to the teacher. There is less respect in a regular class. There's less cooperation, even though you would think you would strive for more. So there is a sort of uneasy paradox here that if you do one thing, the other thing might slip out of your hands. So what we're seeing is for teachers, it's very awkward to have more problems in their classroom because of a weird mixture of media literacy, which addresses core things, not just how to interpret websites or how to look at news, but who are you in this whole process to address that? So that's the message I would like to talk about today is like, how can we find a way to make teachers understand that this is not a nice thing to add onto the curriculum and it solves everything, rather it makes things more difficult. On the other hand, it makes the difficult stuff easier. So that's it for mine, Mina.
Onno, thank you so much. And also to everybody, I just want to say, first of all, in the chat, I see lots of people putting in resources and good links. That's super. Thank you very much. Keep those coming. But also, of course, please put any points of view and questions you'd like to put to our panelists. And let's open up the discussion. You know, we're talking about a lot of challenges there. And I just want to go back to from Iglika a little bit earlier. And this sparks back to what we were talking about earlier in the day, this whole question of frameworks and definitions and what actually are we talking about? You know, sometimes it's this disagreement. Is it MIL? Is it digital media literacy? On the one hand, we have people who feel very strongly about these kinds of definitions and frameworks. They find them very necessary to make this distinction in terms of higher order skills. And then we had somebody like Ricardo earlier today talking about the fact that actually with the digital literacy, we can sort of sneak in media literacy alongside. So it's just a question to the four of you, first of all. And as I say, I'm picking it up really from Iglika from Bulgaria. How important are definitions and frameworks that we need to have a common one? Or do we need to have a common one? Or are we just wasting energy discussing these things? Renee, I see you ready to go. What do you think? Definitions.
I have always understood digital and media literacy to be a moving target, right? That digital and media literacy changes in response to changes in technology, culture, and society. What I have observed is that our efforts to pin it down occur because institutional structures in school and schooling want accountability, and they want precision and clarity, and they want to be able to assess. So of course, definitions and rubrics and standards are great for that within the institutional power structures in which we have to work. I personally find them a little bit oppressive because people cling to their standards once they have created them. And then they get outdated. Then they're no longer responsive to the lived experience of students. So it's a be careful what you wish for a reality. And then I also think there are a fair number of, I don't want to say blame anybody in the community, but there is a way in which you can say, I created the blah, blah, blah. So
yes, done and dusted.
So that's a problem.
Yeah. Juliane, Onno,
yeah,
Matthew?
Yes, I'd love to say something about that. So first of all, in the European context, I would think that digital literacy is also a term that is going to be more acceptable across the European Union. And I am not surprised if the EU has landed on this term, because media literacy and news literacy in some parts of the European Union can flag potential opposition work, right? And what we're trying to do is work with you know, states and governments and not against them. And so, you know, whatever makes the door open, let's do that. That's my view, right?
Good view. That's very clear.
Yes, I do think that. I also think that the work that we did in the teacher guidelines was really interesting, because we had so much conversations about, like, what is it anyway? And we started slicing it, and we started talking about news literacy, digital literacy, political literacy, the business model literacy, like platform literacy, algorithm literacy, and all of these things. And I think it's actually really useful. It's also useful to the teachers, because if you come with massive abstract terms, they don't know what to do. And they teach the kids how to upload a YouTube video and they're done with it. You know?
I'm struck by what Ricardo said this morning about, you know, teaching class on a Monday morning at 9 o'clock. That's when you've got to try and think in terms of what it is that you're doing. Matthew, Onno, any feelings about definitions?
Well, I think obviously I find them useful. As I say, it has been a big part of our project. They're useful in a number of ways. But I will say, of course, I don't think there needs to be a single universal framework that everyone has to agree on. You know, I think what matters about any kind of framework is how useful it is to an individual organization, to a digital literacy movement, and of course to teachers and to students. So for us, this has been a very useful process of, again, integrating digital and media literacy and identifying standards as we've done, because for one thing, it gives us a sense of where we need to allocate energy and resources. It gives us a sense, for instance, are we providing teachers with what they need at all the different grade levels? Are we covering all of the different things? I don't find that it provides rigidity. I find personally that it provides flexibility, because when something new comes up, if your framework is comprehensive, then it's easy to integrate it. And so, for instance, of course, one of the biggest issues of the last few years, which we've been very active in, has been around algorithms in general and recommendation algorithms specifically, as well as, of course, search engine algorithms. And we didn't find that to be very difficult to integrate, because we already had, for instance, the key concept that our digital media experiences are shaped by the tools that we use. And we also had concepts around, of course, the commercial considerations, because that really, in a lot of cases, is what we're concerned around algorithms, is that the algorithms are optimized for profit, and that we don't, if we don't understand the commercial considerations behind those algorithms, it's just as bad as if we don't understand how they work in a mechanical sense. And we also know that teachers do find them tremendously valuable, because again, teachers so often do not feel confident. They don't feel that they've had training. Often they have only had that half day, if that. And again, and that's true here in Canada, even though, again, media literacy has been in the curriculum for 20 years in every province and territory. Teachers still say they don't receive training, they don't receive support. And so having it laid out, if it's done successfully, it shouldn't be a barrier. It should make things easier.
Thanks, Matthew. Onno, you want to come in on that? I see Renee is writing some very interesting comments as well. Check out the chat. Onno?
I think it's all about the goals that we want to achieve, what we want to achieve. If you look at looking at it as a checklist with definitions, it's absolutely oppressing for me. I mean, if I listen to my kids in the classroom, it has nothing to do with the checklists that come from above. To give you one example, I remember one beautiful moment in the classroom in 2011, when a kid said something and I thought she misspoke, but then I started listening more carefully with my wife. And she said that she felt more comfortable online and offline because there were less barriers. How you put that in a checklist that comes from above? I mean, you have to be able to adapt from their point of view. And I think if you look at the goals that I think are important, are resilience, agency, and belonging as goals that you want to achieve for them to be in a digital world where this is going to happen. It's not about checklists. It's about learning to listen and then to adapt with our knowledge and our reflections to the demand that is there on the other side. And that's already a big problem for teachers because they got their curriculum all written down. I don't think they need one more step of more rules to be able to function in the classroom. I think any kind of flexibility would be great for them.
I want to comment on that if I may.
Do.
Onno, you are channeling your inner Len Masterman there. So thank you for that. And I do feel that one of the wisest pieces of insight that I ever got about teacher education came from Carrie Bazalgette of the British Film Institute. Years and years ago, she said, basically, if teachers have an understanding of what Matthew identified as the big ideas, the key concepts of media literacy, then they come into a classroom as listeners, able to recognize what are the paradoxes and challenges that children and teenagers are experiencing in their media culture, and how do the ideas help them navigate, gain resilience, respect diverse perspectives, and have intellectual growth experiences. So I do feel that in a way, go back to Sally's first point, in a way, sometimes the standards, the checklists, the frameworks can trick us and move us away from doing that deep listening that Onno identifies is absolutely important. And really what teachers value most about media literacy is that it allows them to reduce the power relationship between teachers and students to create genuine co-learning. Right? When that co-learning experiences, yes, Onno, you're right. The classroom may be more disruptive. There may be more challenges. There's going to be, but that's when real learning is happening. And teachers love that because they want to connect with their kids.
And one more thing to that. Thank you for all the nice words. What I think is most important for me as well is that concepts can be polarizing in themselves. Give you one example: disinformation. If we frame it as verified fake news, verified false information, the verified part is already saying that if you still adhere to it, you're either a complete moron or you're a bad person, because you should have known, or you could have known, or you willingly do not know. This is a way to polarize the classroom from moment one. The moment you start listening, you might still think it's verified false information that you're hearing, but there is a dialogue, which is, I think, the essence of MIL.
I'd like to say something about that. I would love to hear about best practice and how to make that happen, because I have to say that, you know, as much as we are in this room and at this conference because we have inquiring mindsets and we want to learn things that we don't know, let's face it, that like the teacher's job is to impart knowledge. At the moment, right? A lot of people who've been taught as teachers have been told that what they're supposed to do is impart knowledge. So this idea that they're supposed to come into the classroom and say, I don't know, kids, you tell me, you know, it's actually
scary.
Remarkably, it's a culture change. And that can be remarkably difficult.
And
you know, it also reverses, as you said, I think, yeah, exactly. You just said something about the power relationship, and that can be quite a, you know, that's quite a radical proposition. And how to do that, we put that into the teacher guidelines, right? We should have an inquiry-led approach, blah, 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 right? But how to make that happen? How does that work well? I would like to know. Is there any best practice?
Can I come back to that in one sec? There is lots of best practice, obviously, but I think there is a move generally in teaching. You see that in STEM teaching, you see that right the way across teacher education towards a much more inquiry-led. So I'm not saying it's been answered by any manner of means, but I think this is something we share right the way across in terms of school education. But let me let you back in again. I think, Renee, you wanted to come in first. You were there? No? Or was it, sorry, Onno, Matthew?
Yeah.
Matthew. There you go.
Yeah, and I think part of the value of a comprehensive approach is that we are doing the direct instruction and fostering the discussion. And I think one of the problems, and certainly when we did our literature review for when we were updating our approach, one of the things that we found was that teachers with the best of intentions will take the key concepts approach. They'll take the inquiry approach without teaching their students the critical vocabulary that they need to have to read a media text and to have a critical discussion about it. And that's why, for instance, we have now reading media as one of our framework topics, that if you can't just, for instance, put an ad in front of kids and say, okay, so what do you think? Maybe you can start with that, their initial impression, but you have to teach them the nuts and bolts of how it is constructed. You have to teach them, this is how these decisions were made. This is what is being communicated. This is how the people who made this direct your attention. In English literature, they talk about the rules of notice. How does a writer direct your attention to different ways? And in English literature, of course, it's things like adjectives and sentence structure and rhythm and things like that. But every medium has its rules of notice. And what we found in that literature review is that when one of the most common cases where teachers feel that a media literacy experience has been unsuccessful, it is either when they're in that situation where they have not learned the critical vocabulary, they haven't learned the rules of notice, they haven't taught those things to the students, and they go straight to the critical analysis. But of course, the students can't do the critical analysis. Right. And the teachers, in many cases, they know enough, they've learned it subliminally, they can do the critical analysis, but they can't explain how they did the critical analysis. And so what we see is either students just parroting what the teacher said, and the teacher saying, yes, that's absolutely right, or the students disagreeing, and the teacher not knowing how to say, well, is that an informed disagreement? Or is this are they not making a good argument? Or are students just really not getting the point of it all and saying, well, I like it, so what's the problem? So we need to do both. You do need to be the sage on the stage before you can be the guide on the side. And we need to have that integrated approach.
Just before we come to Juliane, because I know you want to say something to that, I also want to point you to the question that Renee has put in, because we've got a three-dimensional conversation going on here at the moment. Are there differences in different parts of the world in terms of the knowledge transmission approach versus the inquiry learning? So if you have any comments, because we do have people from all sorts of different countries and different parts joining us today, feel free to put your comments in. But let's continue this discussion with Juliane. You wanted to respond to Matthew.
Yeah, I just want to say something about, and it goes back to what Renee was saying at the beginning about creating learning communities. And I think that, look, I am not a teacher. We just deal a lot with teachers, okay? And we see how overburdened they are. And to expect them to have, exercise massive behavioral change, on top of curricular overload, that's quite a, that's like a psychological demand on top of a workload demand, right? And we've been thinking quite deeply about how to create that openness among teachers that they feel able to say among themselves, I don't know. And to the kids, I don't know, because there will be things they won't know. And for instance, our journalists, when they walk into classrooms and the kids say, what was the thing that was going on Reblocks? Like the journalists will go, what's Reblocks? I don't know, right? But nonetheless, a conversation can happen, right? And so we've been thinking about this quite deeply, and we're trying to develop, and we're piloting it now, and we started it and it went really well, but the effort is tremendous. This idea of having a long-term process where the teachers actually agree to spend 4 to 6 months with a journalist, and they can put any question at all, and they create small communities, and within those communities they can say, I don't know, and they can perhaps figure out that. But that's a really lengthy process. That's what I'm getting at. Like, not how do you do an inquiry-led approach, but how do you instill an inquiry-led approach en masse across all teachers? That's what.
Coming to you, Onno, as well, too. I think it's also that scale question as well, too. It's what we're talking about. It's not the once-off thing. It's the scale. It's the community, the ongoingness, if that's such a word. Onno.
It's about the role of the teacher. What do you want the teacher to do? Is he just a transferer of information, or has he got an educational or even a mental health job? And that's a very serious discussion, especially after the pandemic, that we should have. What I love in Poland, what's happening top down, is that the government is saying, look, we have one psychologist or one pedagogue at a school. There's a lot of problems going on, from mental health to radicalization to what have you. This person cannot deal with that. So we need teachers to be able to interact much better with students, be able to have these soft qualities of listening, of being there. And of course, it's a massive burden for teachers to add to it. But the question is, how much of this do we not want to have? Or otherwise, how can we make the curriculum lighter so that these activities become more central? Because there has to be, something has to give.
Yeah.
That point, Renee? Yep.
That great point, and I want to connect the dots to what Juliane was saying, which I think is really really powerful point. I've sometimes been uncomfortable when I have observed journalists in the classroom, because journalists like to talk, they tell war stories, and they have a lot of knowledge that they want to lay on the kids. And what I've seen that works better is when journalists come in and approach it like they're interviewing a source, and ask the kids questions and gather information from the kids, and then look for themes, right? And what the missing piece of that's cool, that's a great pedagogy, and that's a really great way to demonstrate inquiry learning. But what is missing is then we don't have very many good journalistic accounts of what that instructional practice looks like, the inquiry model, so that I can't find a single article in an English language press that describes that pedagogy with precision. And I feel like that's the problem. So we've got a public and a school district community that maybe thinks media literacy is something, but they don't have a good portrait of why inquiry learning is so empowering for kids and what it looks like when it's done well. So if journalists could go that next step and write about that practice, that could be really powerful.
Okay, so I'll say something about that very briefly. So first of all, you're absolutely right. And that's why we're so strict with our journalists. They have got to stick to the script. They're not allowed to tell wars. They're allowed to tell one war story, but the war story that they're allowed to tell is always the war story about when they got it wrong. Because we've got to get people to understand that journalists make mistakes, but just because they make mistakes does not make them equal to some fake news blogger. I'm just going to use a stupid term, right? But you know what I mean, right? So understanding, appreciating the difference between a mistake and like the deliberate manipulation and distortion is so important. And it also adds like this moment of honesty, and fessing up actually adds to the authenticity, which, by the way, from a cognitive psychological point of view, apparently is an incredibly important marker in a time of information overload. The authenticity of the message being conveyed is often more important than the message itself. So what I wanted to say about this, so yes, of course, we can't turn journalists into pedagogues. They're not all suited to that at all, and they should be doing journalism anyway, right? What I do think journalists should be doing, if they consider that their profession is a public service, and not all of them do, of course, right? But let's just imagine all journalists thought that journalism was a public service, then in a world where people are kind of their mini journalists themselves, is it not time for journalists to start not only doing news gathering as a job, but also passing on the skills of news gathering? And the skills of news gathering are inherently inquiry-led, because you're asking questions, you're asking the what's and where's and why's.
The one thing I wanted to add on to that was that, one of the most valuable things that journalists can teach, or that students need to learn about journalism, is simply how the news industry works. The process, because the research into news literacy, which is not a phrase I love, but the research into news literacy has found that what was the strongest predictor of whether someone was able to distinguish between a reliable and unreliable news source was how well they understood the news industry. Like how a story gets assigned, how a story gets written, how a mistake gets corrected. That kind of nuts and bolts stuff is what allows people to be critical thinkers when it comes to media. And one of the things that we see so often is a misunderstanding, people thinking that journalists get orders from on high about what to cover and what not to cover. And or even people not understanding the difference between a news story and an opinion piece. And certainly here in North America, I can't speak to Europe, here in North America, there are news outlets that do their very best to blur those differences. And there are news outlets that do act in the way that people mistakenly think legitimate news outlets do. So the confusion is understandable, but that is another example of how some of that core knowledge is an essential groundwork for inquiry and critical thinking.
Matthew, thank you. I'm actually going to draw this to a close, but I know Onno wants to get one last word in. Onno, last word.
What we do with kids is we ask them to ask other kids the same question in the whole school, which for instance is, what do you need right now? And it's a simple question, they get simple answers, and then they have to edit it for understandability, speak the text into the microphone, and we make a little film out of it. Then you see a whole pluralistic approach of what the school is thinking. Then they have to think again what they think about it. So it's not like ingraining journalism as such. It's rather how to listen as a journalist, because what we see if we do little interviews between kids, after 10 seconds, they don't know what to ask anymore. The curiosity is not really a motor for them often. So what we teach them is to be more curious as a starting point for journalism. And then you need the whole frame that we talk about.
A starting point probably for teacher education as well. And I'm going to draw this to a close because I promised we'd stick to time, and we almost are. And I have a couple of quick notices to put in before we close. But Renee, Onno, Juliane and Matthew, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody. There's been loads of stuff going on in the chat as well. Lots of documents to follow up with. So I hope you have a chance to look at that. We promise we'll send everybody who's registered a link to the recording for the whole day. We'll send you a recap document, which will give you the presentations and also everything that appeared in the chat as well. So you'll get that from us. I wanted to make a couple of just final announcements, if I may, just to remind people that first of all, we have a newsletter going out every month, lots of interesting articles and things this recently. As always, for example, you can look at the guidelines from the European Commission for Teachers and Educators, news item, the Fulbright NATO report from Tessa Joles. There's also the Jordan Hill talking about algorithm literacy. There's also the Baltic states using MIL. Thank you so much for ALGSA for that. And of course, we also have Juliane and Adeline on the input they had recently from teachers. As you know, we also, if I could move on to the next one, we're delighted to be starting our new project in January on teacher education and digital media literacy. So stay tuned for that. We'll let everybody know again who is registered for today about that project. And when we get started, we hope we're going to have lots of these discussions because we think there's a huge amount that could be shared, not only the experiences and the resources, but also the ideas and helping us to move forward and to really scale up teacher education in this area. A couple of final other things, if I put up the next one, if I could. Next slide, just to remind you all, Medea Awards is now open for entries. Please submit your entry before the 17th of March. We're looking for the best uses of media to support teaching and learning. All the information is on the slide, and our final slide will just link you to our website, to our upcoming events. 16th of November, we'll be talking about media literacy and practice in France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, and the Netherlands. That's the series we're running in collaboration with Edmo. And then we will have a workshop on the 14th of December online on our Smiles project, which is all about creating resources for librarians and teachers for the 12 to 16-year-olds. Our conference is next June, and that's our website. You can see at the bottom, and just to say thank you very much for joining us. We're a minute over our time. My apologies, but I hope you have enjoyed the day. My thanks to Chloe and to Dovi, who are a great team, and also, of course, to all of our speakers, and particularly to Andy and Igor for doing a great job in moderating early on. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you at our next event. Bye-bye now.